Isaac Granger sat in the cold, dimly lit kitchen, staring into his coffee cup as his children quietly ate their breakfast. The creaking of the old house seemed louder than usual this morning, echoing in the silence that had hung over them since Mary died. Emma, Noah, and little Mary ate mechanically, each lost in their thoughts, their eyes dull. The chair where Mary used to sit remained empty, its stillness a constant reminder of her absence. For 427 days, there had been no laughter, no joy, just a deep, aching emptiness that hung like a dark cloud over the house. Isaac could feel it in his bones, this weight of silence. Every day, he counted the hours, marking another day since the life had drained out of his family. He had tried everything, tried to be a good father, tried to fill the void, but nothing had worked. His children had closed themselves off, too young to understand why their mother was gone, too old to forget the pain. Emma, once a bright and lively child, had become a ghost of the girl she used to be. Noah, usually full of stories, barely spoke at all. Little Mary, barely 4, had stopped giggling when she played with her doll. The silence between them was deafening. And Isaac? He was simply surviving, not living, just moving through the days. It was on this gray March morning, with the wind howling outside and the snow thick on the ground, that Isaac made his way out to the barn. He heard a strange sound, something between a moan and a whimper, and instinctively, he followed it. As he pushed open the barn door, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying half-conscious in the hay, was a woman. Her skin was pale, lips nearly blue, and her body shook with chills. She clutched something tightly to her chest, an old, worn photograph. Her eyes fluttered open when Isaac approached, and she gasped, a look of terror flashing across her face. Don't let him find me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He'll kill my daughter." Isaac's heart pounded. "Where is your daughter?" he asked, kneeling beside her. The woman's eyes filled with panic as she tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the hay. Her hand clenched tighter around the photograph. "Ellie," she breathed, the name almost a prayer. "My daughter. I have to find her." Isaac didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave her here like this, not in the freezing cold. With one arm, he lifted her gently, cradling her in his arms despite her ragged breathing and the fever that burned through her skin. He carried her toward the house, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she so scared? And who was this man who had taken her daughter? When Isaac stepped through the door, the children stopped eating and looked up, eyes wide with curiosity. Emma was the first to speak, her voice tentative. "Who is she, Papa?" Isaac paused, glancing over at his children. They hadn't spoken much in weeks, not even to ask questions. Their silence was a kind of language now, one he had come to know well. But this was different. They were looking at the woman in his arms with something that resembled concern, even if it was unfamiliar. Isaac didn't have an answer. Not yet. "She's hurt," he said softly. "We're going to help her." He carried the woman into the small room that had once belonged to Mary, the sewing room. He laid her gently on the bed, and as he began to examine her wounds, something fell from her hand. The photograph she had been clutching. Isaac picked it up. The photo was of the woman, a little girl who looked about 4 years old, and a man. The man's face had been scratched out violently, as though someone had tried to erase him entirely. The woman stirred in her sleep, mumbling. "Ellie, where's Ellie?" she gasped, her voice panicked. Isaac's brow furrowed. "Your daughter?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes still closed. He took her. "I have to find her. Please." As she fell unconscious again, Isaac sat back, staring at the photo in his hand. The picture, the woman's frantic words, everything seemed to hold a mystery that was bigger than he could understand. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward her. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, and whatever had happened to her, it was clear she wasn't safe. But Isaac couldn't let her die, not like this. Not when she had escaped something so terrible. As he worked to cool her fever with a damp cloth, She muttered more incoherent words, bits of a story he couldn't yet piece together. The train? Thursday. Lincoln County. She began to tremble again, her voice fading into delirium. Isaac's heart sank. This woman had escaped from something horrible, something he couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. She had lost her daughter, and if Isaac could help her find her, he would. He looked toward the children, who were now peeking around the doorframe, a sense of curiosity on their faces for the first time in months. Little Mary clutched her doll tightly, as if trying to comfort the sick lady. "Papa," Mary whispered, her voice small, "will she be okay?" Isaac's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he heard his daughter's voice, soft and full of concern. "We'll make sure she's okay," he said, his voice steady even as doubt gnawed at him. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "He'll kill my daughter." Isaac couldn't help but wonder, who was this man, and what was he capable of? The thought lingered as he watched the children, their faces filled with something he hadn't seen in so long, emotion. Little Mary, with her doll in hand, stepped forward and gently placed it next to the sick woman's bed. "To keep the lady company," she said, her voice small but certain. Isaac watched, a heavy sense of hope stirring in his chest for the first time in over a year. Perhaps, just perhaps, this stranger, the woman who had collapsed in his barn, would bring his children back to life, just as he had once done for them. But first, he needed to know, where was Ellie? And who had taken her? Isaac's thoughts were interrupted by the woman's quiet muttering, her fever rising again. He needed to get her to safety. The clock was ticking. The days that followed were a blur of care and worry. Catherine, as Isaac had learned her name was, remained unconscious for 3 long days, her body racked with fever, her mind slipping in and out of delirium. Isaac stayed by her side, tending to her as best he could with the limited supplies at hand. Every morning, he would bring her a fresh bowl of broth, cool her burning skin with wet cloths, and apply pine bark poultices to her infected shoulder. His children, hesitant at first, slowly began to take part. Emma, who had once been so withdrawn, quietly began fetching water from the well without being asked. Noah, his small hands clumsy but eager, wrung the cloths with precision. They were beginning to emerge from their silence, their actions speaking louder than words. For the first time in months, Isaac noticed the familiar hum of Emma's voice as she worked, a song so faint it barely filled the room. But it was something. Catherine, in her fevered dreams, muttered pieces of a past she couldn't escape. "Robert, please don't hurt her," she whimpered, a tear slipping from her closed eyes. Isaac was no stranger to the name Robert. He'd heard it in Catherine's delirium several times now, alongside whispers of a train station of Lincoln County. The mention of Samuel's ranch, 40 miles east, meant something. His mind churned, trying to piece together the fragments of her broken story. But it was only when she woke on the 3rd day that he learned the truth. Catherine stirred, her fever still high, but her eyes snapped open, wide with panic. 3 days? The train left Thursday. She gasped, struggling to sit up. Isaac was at her side in an instant, steadying her as she tried to rise. "Slow down," he urged, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me what happened." "Everything." She paused, her breath shaky, as if trying to gather the strength to speak. And then she did. "I escaped," she began in a hoarse whisper. 2 weeks ago, Robert, my husband, found us. He's a violent man. I ran with Ellie, my daughter. We were going to California to my sister's house, but Robert found us at the Lincoln County station." She paused, tears welling up in her eyes. "He beat me there, took Ellie, left me bleeding in an alley." Isaac's heart twisted at the thought, but he kept his expression neutral, hiding the rage that bubbled up inside. "I followed him," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "for days. The infection set in from the wound, and I didn't know where to turn. I couldn't lose her, Isaac. I couldn't. And then I collapsed." She looked up at him, her eyes desperate. "Please, help me get her back. I'll work for you. I'll pay you anything." Isaac, who had heard all he needed to hear, shook his head. "You don't have to bargain," he said firmly. "We'll get your daughter." Catherine's expression softened, though the worry in her eyes remained. "Samuel Albright. He's the one who took Ellie to his ranch. 40 miles east. You'll never get to her." Isaac paused for a long moment. Samuel Albright was a name he knew well. A horse breeder, hard as iron, respected by everyone, feared by most. The man didn't take kindly to strangers, and he certainly wouldn't welcome someone like Isaac on his property. But Isaac's mind was made up. He had to try. For Catherine, for Ellie, and for his children. "We'll figure it out," Isaac said quietly, his resolve hardening. As he looked at his children, still standing in the doorway, he could see the curiosity in their eyes for the first time in over a year. Emma, usually so withdrawn, took a tentative step forward. "We're going to help her get her little girl back," she asked, her voice small but full of hope. Isaac nodded, the weight of the promise pressing down on him. "Yes," he said, "we're going to help." Emma's lips trembled slightly, and then, for the first time in months, she gave a small smile, barely there but undeniably real. Little Mary, who had barely spoken a word since her mother's death, looked up at Catherine with wide, innocent eyes. "Is Ellie nice? Can she be my friend?" she asked. Catherine's eyes welled up with tears, her heart breaking at the thought of her daughter's future. "She would love that, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing a lock of hair from Mary's face. The little girl beamed, and for a moment, it felt like the first glimmer of hope Isaac had seen in a long time. The children's questions continued, each one a reminder that they were beginning to care again. Emma, who had once been so distant, now asked about Ellie's favorite games, her favorite colors. Noah, who had been so quiet, eagerly showed Catherine his wooden toy soldiers, explaining how each one had its own story, its own battle. Isaac watched, his heart swelling with a bittersweet sense of relief. They were coming back to life. Little Mary, who had barely shown any emotion since her mother's death, smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. It was a small, shy smile, but it was real. Isaac couldn't help but feel a lump rise in his throat as he watched his children interact with Catherine, their walls starting to crumble. She was doing what he couldn't. She was making them feel again. "We'll help you find Ellie. Promise," Noah said with determination. It was a simple promise, but meant the world to Isaac. He could feel something stirring within him. Hope? Yes, but also something more. The possibility of a family, a real family, returning to this house. He glanced at Catherine, who was watching the children with a gentle smile. And for the first time in over a year, Isaac allowed himself to believe in a future where laughter and joy could return to their home. That evening, after Catherine had insisted on helping with breakfast, Isaac watched as she cooked pancakes, something he had never known how to do. His wife, Mary, had always been the one to make pancakes, her gentle laughter filling the kitchen as she worked. It was a simple, small act, but it felt like a bridge between then and now. Catherine hummed as she worked, her voice soft and comforting. Emma, who had grown quiet again, looked up from her seat at the table. "What song is that?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Catherine paused, her hands stilling for a moment. "It's called Home on the Range. My mother used to sing it to me when I was a little girl." Emma's eyes widened. "My mama sang that too," she whispered, a note of sadness in her voice. For a moment, there was only silence, a shared connection between Catherine and Emma. Little Mary, sitting on her father's lap, smiled as she tasted her first bite of pancakes. It was a small smile, but it was real. Isaac watched, his heart full, as his children came back to life, one smile at a time. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Isaac and Catherine sat together, planning the rescue mission. Samuel Albright's ranch was no small challenge. It was heavily fortified, his men loyal to him without question. Isaac knew that getting Ellie back would take strategy, not force. He explained to Catherine that they would need to be clever. They couldn't just walk in and demand Ellie. They had to make sure they were prepared. Isaac had a plan, one that would require both of them to play roles. He would pose as a horse buyer. No one would question a man interested in purchasing a few of Samuel's prized horses. Catherine, though still weak, would accompany him as his housekeeper. The plan was risky, but it was the best chance they had. They couldn't afford to fail. "We leave in 3 days," Isaac said, his tone resolute. "It will give you time to heal." Catherine nodded, her eyes determined. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Isaac just smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You're not strangers anymore." The next morning, Isaac watched as the children went about their daily chores with renewed purpose. Emma braided Catherine's hair, a task she had refused to let anyone else do since her mother's death. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. "Thank you," Emma whispered as she finished, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Catherine hugged her tightly. "I'm just glad I could help." Noah, too, had opened up, showing Catherine his wooden soldiers and telling her stories about the battles they had fought. Isaac stood by the door, watching as his children found their way back to one another and to her. The next few days were filled with quiet bonding, and the atmosphere in the house began to change. Catherine helped with laundry, shared stories of her own childhood, and even taught Emma how to braid her hair. Little Mary, once a silent observer, began to sing again, her voice soft but sweet as she hummed along with Catherine. Isaac watched it all, his heart swelling. His children were returning to life, and Catherine was the reason. That evening, before they were to leave, Isaac and Catherine sat by the fire. The children had gone to bed, and the house felt quieter now, almost peaceful. Catherine looked at him, her eyes full of emotion. When Mary died, Isaac said softly, "I thought I'd never feel whole again." Catherine reached out, her hand brushing his. "I know that feeling," she replied quietly. They sat in silence, their hands touching on the table between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was beginning to form between them. It was unspoken, but it was there. Neither pulled away. Not yet, but soon. The day before Isaac and Catherine were set to leave, Isaac gathered his children in the kitchen, the faintest flicker of hope growing in his chest. He knew the plan wasn't without risks, but it was their best chance to bring Ellie home. "I need you all to listen carefully," Isaac said, his voice steady despite the worry gnawing at him. The children sat around the table, Emma and Noah with their eyes fixed on him, little Mary playing with her doll in her lap. "Tomorrow, we're going to help bring Ellie back. But this won't be easy. The ranch we're going to is big, and Samuel Albright doesn't let strangers in. We have to be clever about how we do this." Isaac explained the plan. He would pose as a horse buyer, a reason to be at Samuel's ranch without raising suspicion. Catherine would accompany him as his housekeeper, a role that would give her access to the house. Once they found Ellie, they would leave under the cover of darkness, using a wagon with a hidden compartment to keep her safe. Emma, Noah, and little Mary listened intently, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. Isaac had promised them he would bring Ellie back, and his children, who had been so silent for so long, were now eager to be part of the rescue. The next few days were a flurry of activity as the plan took shape. Isaac taught Catherine how to ride the faster horses, a necessary skill if things went wrong. Catherine, despite her weariness, picked up the skill quickly, surprising Isaac with her strength and determination. "You're stronger than you think," Isaac said, watching her handle the reins with confidence. She flashed him a small, tired smile, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. She was ready. Meanwhile, Isaac worked on securing the necessary supplies for the trip: medical supplies, food, and blankets. He kept his mind focused, his actions mechanical, knowing that every detail had to be perfect. The more he worked, the more he realized that this mission was about more than just rescuing a child. It was about bringing his family back together. He had spent too many days in the silence of the past year, watching his children withdraw into themselves. But now, with Catherine's arrival, there was hope. Emma, Noah, and little Mary were starting to open up again, their voices filling the house in a way that had been absent for far too long. Emma had even started to braid her hair, a small but significant gesture of reclaiming a sense of normalcy. Noah had begun to talk again, telling stories to Catherine about his wooden soldiers. Little Mary had started singing again, her soft voice floating through the house like a breeze on a summer day. Isaac could see in their eyes they were beginning to heal, and Catherine was at the center of it. He watched as Catherine spent time with the children, teaching them new things, helping them with chores, and sharing stories of her own childhood. Emma, who had once kept her distance, now sought out Catherine's company, asking questions about her life before everything changed. There were moments of connection, fleeting but real, that Isaac had almost forgotten were possible. One afternoon, Isaac watched from the doorway as Catherine helped Emma with her braids, her hands gentle as she guided Emma's fingers through the motions. Emma had cried at first, the memories of her mother's touch too fresh, but Catherine had patiently encouraged her, and now Emma was smiling, her braids perfect. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Catherine's heart ached, and she wrapped her arms around the girl, her eyes closing for a brief moment as she let herself feel the weight of it all. "You're welcome," Catherine replied softly. "I'm glad I could help." It was moments like these that reminded Isaac why he had agreed to help Catherine, why he had chosen to trust her. His children were coming back to life, and Catherine was the spark that had reignited the flame. It wasn't just Ellie they were rescuing. It was their future. The night before they were to leave, Catherine tucked each of the children in a bed, a task that had once belonged to Mary. Little Mary clung to Catherine's side, her tiny hand gripping her sleeve as she whispered, "Please come back. Please bring Ellie home with you." Catherine's heart broke at the request, and she kissed Mary's forehead. "I'll come back, sweetheart. I promise," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She kissed Emma and Noah too, each of them holding her tightly for a moment longer than usual. They were all desperate for the promise of a better future, one where laughter filled the house and joy returned to their lives. Isaac watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and hope. He had never expected to find something so real, so strong, in the midst of all the pain. Catherine had become a part of this family, a mother to his children in ways he hadn't even known were possible. As he watched her say good night to the children, he felt something shift between them, a connection that had been slowly growing but had never been acknowledged. They were standing on the edge of something, and Isaac could feel it deep in his chest. "You're doing more than you know," Isaac said quietly as Catherine walked back toward him. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with the same quiet understanding. "So are you," she whispered. There were no words to describe the weight of what had been said, but they didn't need words. They both understood. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Isaac stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. He knew that tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, something uncertain but full of possibility. And as he turned to look at Catherine, standing by the fire, he realized just how much he had come to care for her, how much he had come to need her. She had saved his children, and in doing so, she had saved him. Catherine stepped forward, her hand brushing his. The touch was simple but meaningful, a gesture that spoke volumes. Isaac's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope. As they prepared for the journey, Isaac felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. This wasn't just about bringing Ellie back. It was about healing, about family, about rebuilding a life from the ashes of the past. Tomorrow, they would begin that journey, together. The morning dawned cold and still, the sun barely rising over the distant mountains as Isaac and Catherine prepared to leave. Isaac moved through the house with a quiet urgency, checking the wagon one last time, ensuring the hidden compartment was well stocked with blankets, food, and medical supplies. His rifle, secured under the driver's seat, was his only protection against the unknown dangers they might encounter. As Catherine came out of the house, adjusting the brim of her hat and checking her bundle of belongings, Isaac glanced at her, his expression unreadable. There was a strength in her now, a resolve that had been absent when they first met. He admired her for it, even as the weight of the task ahead pressed on his shoulders. The children stood at the door, their faces full of quiet hope, but none of them spoke. They had come to understand the magnitude of what Isaac was about to do. Little Mary, clutching her doll, whispered, "Bring Ellie home, Papa," her voice barely above a murmur. Isaac leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I will, sweetheart. I promise." With a final glance at his children, Isaac climbed into the wagon, helping Catherine up beside him. The horses were restless, eager to be on their way. As they pulled out of the yard, Isaac glanced back at the house one last time, the familiar creak of the wagon wheels the only sound breaking the early morning silence. He didn't know when he would be back. He didn't know if they would succeed, but he had made a promise. The journey to Samuel Albright's ranch would take most of the day, and with the sun low in the sky, Isaac felt the weight of the hours ahead. The road stretched before them, covered in snow and ice, but the wagon moved steadily forward. Catherine sat beside him, her face pale but determined. Every now and then, she glanced at him, her eyes full of the same quiet fear he felt but wouldn't show. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need for words. The plan was simple, but the stakes were high. They would arrive at Samuel's ranch, pretending to be a wealthy buyer looking to purchase horses. Catherine would accompany Isaac as his housekeeper, a cover that would allow her to move about the house without suspicion. The ranch hands, Isaac knew, would be loyal to Samuel, and they would not easily question a man like him. But Samuel himself was another matter. Isaac knew Samuel was a hard man, as stubborn and unyielding as the land he worked. And if Robert was there, things could get dangerous fast. Isaac's thoughts were interrupted when Catherine's voice broke the silence. "Do you think he'll let us in?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Isaac turned to her, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "He'll have to," he said quietly. "We're not giving him much of a choice." The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken fears they both held. Isaac knew Samuel well enough to know that the man wouldn't give up a child easily, especially one who was as important to him as Ellie was. But Isaac wasn't giving up either. He had promised Catherine, and he had promised his children. No matter what it took, he would bring Ellie home. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Samuel's ranch was everything Isaac had expected: large, well-maintained, and imposing. There were several buildings scattered across the property, barns, stables, and a large house that stood at the center. The place was alive with activity. Men working in the fields, tending to the horses, and moving about the property like ants in a hive. Samuel Albright, as expected, was waiting for them. He stood near the stable, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing as the wagon rolled to a stop in front of him. "You're the Granger from up north?" Samuel's voice was gruff, and Isaac could tell that the man was sizing him up, trying to decide if he was a threat. "That's right," Isaac replied, his tone steady, his eyes meeting Samuel's without hesitation. "I've heard you breed some of the best horses in Wyoming. I'm in the market for a few good stock." Samuel didn't seem impressed. "Don't recognize your face," he said, still eyeing Isaac with suspicion. "Where are you from exactly?" "Western Wyoming," Isaac said, his voice smooth. "Granger Ranch. I've heard good things about your horses." Samuel's eyes flicked to Catherine, who was sitting quietly next to Isaac, her face obscured by a simple veil. "And who's this?" Samuel asked, his tone less hostile but still guarded. "My housekeeper," Isaac replied. "I brought her along to help with a trip." Samuel nodded, though there was no warmth in the gesture. Well, I've got horses, he said, his voice flat. But you'll need to prove you're serious. I don't entertain just anyone. Isaac knew this was part of the game. Samuel would test him, see if he was really interested in buying horses or if there was some other reason he was here. Isaac wasn't surprised when Samuel led him to the stables, showing him several of his finest horses. The horses were beautiful, strong animals, and Isaac made a show of inspecting them closely, running his hands over their coats, checking their hooves, asking questions about their breeding lines. As they spoke, Catherine stayed back, standing quietly near the door, her eyes scanning the property, her body tense. She was waiting for a moment, but it wasn't long before she had a chance. As they walked toward the house to discuss prices, Catherine slipped inside the back door, unseen by the men. The house was quiet, the floors creaking underfoot as she moved through the hallways, searching for any sign of Ellie. She reached the kitchen, where she found a woman, Samuel's wife, Margaret, preparing lunch. "Can I help with anything?" Catherine asked, her voice calm but with a subtle edge of urgency. Margaret, a stern woman, glanced up from her work. "We got it under control," she said. "You just stay out of the way." Catherine nodded, but as she turned to leave, she heard a small voice coming from upstairs. A soft cry, followed by the words, "I want my mama." The blood drained from Catherine's face. It was Ellie. Catherine's heart raced as she moved toward the stairs, but before she could reach them, she saw Margaret coming down the hall. Catherine froze, her hand pressing against the doorframe. "That's our niece," Margaret said, her voice sharp. Her mother abandoned her. Catherine felt a surge of rage wash over her, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't risk exposing herself now. As she turned to leave, she saw Robert Albright outside in the yard, his back turned to her. He was packing saddlebags onto a horse, preparing to leave. Catherine's pulse quickened. If they didn't act fast, he would take Ellie with him. She stepped back into the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get Isaac's attention. They had no time to waste. The tension in the air was palpable as Robert Albright's voice carried through the yard, barking orders to his men as he prepared to leave. Isaac felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his heart racing with the realization that time was running out. He glanced at Catherine, who was standing by the barn, her face pale and filled with determination. He knew what she was thinking. If they didn't act now, they would lose Ellie for good. The plan they had meticulously crafted was about to fall apart, and he couldn't let that happen. Isaac turned to Samuel, who was standing beside him, watching with narrowed eyes as Isaac inspected the horses. "You're not quite what I expected, Granger," Samuel said, his voice low and probing, but Isaac couldn't afford to be distracted. He had to get Samuel's attention away from the impending danger. "You say these horses are the best," Isaac replied, his voice smooth and confident. "But I'm not convinced. Let's see how they perform in a race." A proper test. Samuel's expression shifted, a mixture of pride and suspicion flashing in his eyes. "A race? You think I'm some kind of showman?" he asked, clearly intrigued despite himself. Isaac nodded, playing into Samuel's ego. "I'm willing to wager $100. If you can beat my horse, then I'll take a dozen of your best." Samuel's face lit up with a challenge, his lips curling into a smile that showed just how eager he was to prove himself. "You're on," he said, "but you better hope your horse is fast." Samuel called over his ranch hands, including Robert, who looked up, his expression hardening as he saw Isaac's intent. Isaac ignored the look, his mind focused on one thing only, getting to Ellie. As the ranch hands gathered, Samuel and Isaac made their way to the far pasture to set up the race. The tension between them was thick, but Isaac remained calm, keeping his attention on the task at hand. He knew the race would be a distraction, a way to buy them precious minutes to execute their plan. Catherine, meanwhile, had slipped inside the house. She had seen Robert packing and knew this was their last chance. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Ellie's faint cries from upstairs, and it nearly broke her resolve. But she kept going, stepping carefully into the hallway. She reached the stairs just as Margaret returned to the kitchen, and Catherine held her breath, waiting for the woman to pass. When Margaret turned her back, Catherine darted up the stairs, her heart in her throat. She found Ellie's room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Ellie sat on the floor, her little face tear-streaked, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. Catherine's heart swelled with emotion, and she crouched down beside Ellie. "Yes, baby," she said softly, her voice breaking with the weight of it all. "It's me. We're leaving now. We're going home." Ellie's eyes filled with tears, and she stood shakily, looking up at Catherine with a mix of hope and fear. "But Uncle Samuel said you were dead," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Catherine's heart shattered as she scooped Ellie into her arms, holding her tight. "He lied," Catherine said, her voice fierce. "I'll never leave you again, I promise." She wrapped Ellie in a shawl and began to make her way down the stairs, every step feeling like a battle. As she neared the bottom, she heard Margaret's voice from the kitchen. Catherine froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't be caught. Not now. Not when they were so close. Without thinking, she bolted for the back door, Ellie clutched tightly in her arms. But as she reached the threshold, Margaret stepped into the hallway, her eyes widening as she saw what Catherine was doing. "What are you doing with that child?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. Catherine didn't hesitate. "She's mine," Catherine said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "We're leaving." Margaret's eyes flickered with recognition, but before she could shout for help, Catherine had bolted out the door, running as fast as she could. "Sam!" Margaret screamed, but it was too late. Isaac, having heard the commotion, spurred his horse into action. He raced toward the barn, his heart racing as he saw Catherine running toward the wagon, Ellie in her arms. But Robert had already spotted them. He pulled his gun from his belt, aiming it at Catherine as she reached the wagon. "Stop right there!" Robert shouted, his voice full of rage. Isaac was already on top of him. He spurred his horse forward, intercepting Robert just before he could fire. Isaac tackled him to the ground, knocking the gun from Robert's hand, and the two men rolled in the dirt, struggling for control. Robert was strong, but Isaac was fueled by something stronger, his promise to his children, to Catherine, to the family he was trying to build. As the two men fought, Samuel and his ranch hands emerged from the barn, rifles raised. The tension was palpable, and Isaac knew that things were about to get out of hand. "Let him go, Granger," Samuel shouted, his voice full of authority. "You're not going anywhere with her." But Isaac didn't flinch. He kept his grip tight on Robert, his eyes fierce. "You want to fight me, Samuel?" Isaac said, his voice cold and steady. "Or do you want to face the truth?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes flickering between Isaac and Robert. Catherine, holding Ellie tightly, stepped forward. "I'm her mother," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "Look at her. She's terrified of him. He's not a father. He's a monster." Samuel's gaze shifted to Robert, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, something shifted in Samuel's eyes, something that looked like doubt, like guilt. Isaac held his breath, waiting for Samuel's reaction. Just then, the sound of approaching horses broke the silence, and the group turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley and two deputies riding up. Bradley's eyes quickly took in the scene. Isaac and Robert on the ground, rifles raised, Catherine holding Ellie, and the tension hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. "What's going on here?" Bradley demanded, his voice authoritative. Robert, panting and furious, yelled, "Sheriff, this woman kidnapped my daughter." But Catherine stepped forward, her voice shaking but unwavering. "I'm rescuing her from a man who's been abusing her, Sheriff. This is my daughter, and I'm not going to let him take her again." Bradley surveyed the scene for a long moment, then slowly lowered his hand. "Everybody lower your weapons," he said. "Now!" The ranch hands hesitated, but one by one, they lowered their rifles. Bradley's eyes narrowed as he looked at Robert. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Robert," he said, his voice grim. Robert glared, but he didn't move. Bradley turned to Catherine, his eyes softening. "Ma'am, you got any proof of all this?" Catherine nodded, her hand shaking as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her marriage certificate and Ellie's birth certificate. "I'm her legal mother," Catherine said quietly, "and I'm here to take my daughter home." Bradley took the papers, examining them closely. Robert, now standing up, sputtered. "She ran off. She abandoned us." But Catherine stood tall. "I ran for my life," she said, her voice firm. "And now I'm here to save her." Bradley turned to Samuel, his gaze hardening. "Samuel, you knew what was going on here, didn't you?" Samuel looked away, his face hardening as he turned to Robert. "I didn't know, Sheriff. I believe his lies. But I should have known better." Isaac's heart swelled with hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice was on their side. The journey back to the ranch was quiet but filled with an unspoken bond between Isaac, Catherine, and Ellie. The weight of what had happened still hung heavily in the air. But as they rode in the wagon, the oppressive silence that had plagued Isaac's home for so long seemed to lift. Ellie, wrapped tightly in her shawl, sat close to Catherine, her small hand clasped in hers. The look of relief in Catherine's eyes as she held her daughter was something Isaac hadn't seen before. Hope, raw and fragile, but something real. Ellie, though still too young to fully understand everything that had happened, clung to Catherine with a quiet trust, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. Isaac kept his eyes ahead, his mind replaying the events of the day. The sheriff's intervention had been a blessing, but it had also made Isaac realize how much had been left unspoken, how much pain had been carried in silence for so long. As the ranch grew closer on the horizon, Isaac found himself wondering what the future would look like now for all of them. They had made it through the worst of it, but the true challenge was yet to come. The world they were returning to was one that had been shaped by loss, by silence, and by an overwhelming need to survive. But now, with Ellie safe, with Catherine by his side, Isaac could see a glimmer of a new life emerging. The ranch came into view as they crested the hill, its buildings bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The house, the barn, the fields, they all seemed unchanged, yet Isaac knew that everything had shifted. He had promised Catherine that he would bring her home, but what did that promise mean now? Catherine was not just a guest anymore. She had become a part of his family, a part of something bigger than survival. And Ellie, her wide eyes full of wonder and uncertainty, was the missing piece that had somehow made it all feel right. The children were waiting for them. Emma, Noah, and little Mary stood at the porch, their eyes wide with anticipation. And as the wagon approached, they rushed forward, shouting in unison, "You're back! You're back!" Isaac slowed the wagon to a stop, and the children surrounded it, eager to see their new sister. Little Mary, her hands clutching the hem of her dress, stepped forward shyly. She looked at Ellie, her big brown eyes full of curiosity. "I'm Mary," she said in a small voice. "Want to be friends?" Ellie hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between Catherine and Isaac, then looked down at the ground. But when she lifted her gaze to Mary, there was something soft in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, a connection between two girls who had known too much pain for their age. Ellie nodded and shyly extended her hand to Mary. "Okay," she said quietly. The exchange was small, but it was significant. A bond had been formed, a thread of connection between two young souls who had, up until now, known nothing but fear and loss. Isaac felt a pang in his chest as he watched his children interact with Ellie. This wasn't just about bringing a child back from the brink of despair. It was about giving them all a chance to start over, to heal, to find a new normal amidst the wreckage of the past. "Welcome home, Ellie," Emma said, her voice warm and welcoming as she stepped forward to give her new sister a hug. Ellie stiffened at first, unsure of what to make of the gesture, but slowly she returned the embrace, her small arms circling Emma's waist. For the first time in over a year, Isaac saw his children smiling. Real smiles, the kind that came from a place of joy, not just survival. Catherine, who had been standing beside Isaac, watching the scene unfold, felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, not wanting to make it obvious, but Isaac caught the movement. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's a good day, Catherine," he said softly, his voice low but full of emotion. "A better day than I've had in a long time." Catherine turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with the same mix of emotions that flooded Isaac's chest. "It is," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever get here. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." Isaac squeezed her shoulder, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. There was a connection between them now, something deeper than mere necessity or circumstance. It was a shared understanding of the weight they both carried, a weight that had been lifted piece by piece as they had fought for Ellie's safety. As they made their way into the house, the children were already bustling around the table, chattering excitedly about their day, about everything and nothing all at once. Isaac and Catherine joined them, sitting down to the evening meal, and for the first time in months, the house felt full of life, full of noise, full of love. Isaac looked around at the faces of his children, the warmth of the meal in front of them, and the soft glow of the lanterns on the table. This was the life he had fought for, the family he had nearly given up on. As they ate, the conversation turned to simple things, what they had seen during the day, the games they had played, the animals on the ranch. But as the evening wore on, Isaac found himself lost in the sound of his children's laughter, the chatter of their voices, and the soft hum of a family coming back together. Later, as the children were tucked into bed, Isaac sat with Catherine on the porch, the cool night air brushing across their faces. The stars above shone brightly, as if marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his in the dark. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice full of quiet wonder. "Do you think this could last? Do you think we've really found our place?" Isaac didn't hesitate. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady and sure. "I know it will last," he said, "because we've all chosen it. We've chosen each other." There was a pause, and then Catherine smiled, a soft, radiant smile that reached her eyes, the kind of smile that Isaac hadn't seen in far too long. "I think you're right," she said softly. "We've all chosen each other." Isaac's heart swelled as he looked out at the horizon, the ranch now bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. He had lost so much, but he had found something worth fighting for again, something real. The silence that had once hung over their home was now filled with laughter, with love, with the kind of peace that had seemed impossible just months before. They had fought for each other, and they had won. In the end, Isaac realized it wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about choosing to love, to rebuild, to make a new family, not just out of blood, but out of the choices they made one day at a time. As the night deepened, Isaac and Catherine sat together in comfortable silence. The stars above them a reminder that no matter how dark the night had been, there would always be a new dawn. And with that dawn, they would face the future together.